All right. Thank you, Emmy and IDG, and for all of you for coming here today. So what my topic is I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the biggest breach in our U.S. government history and really share with you some of the lessons learned, tell you what happened, how we responded, how we detected this particular breach, and the lessons that we learned and implemented across the federal government based on this breach. This is just a little bit of background about myself, and my role in kind of that breach. So first of all, I was a chief information officer for one of the agencies in the federal government. I worked in the international cybersecurity practice of Ernst & Young before that, worked for a startup, and I was also in our United States Army in the reserves, and I served on the Army emergency response team, cyber emergency response team, both all over the world and as part of Operation Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom. So spent time doing that over in Kuwait, Iraq, et cetera. So that's just my background. My role in this, what I was doing prior to and during the breach. First of all, I was at the White House. I was the Federal Deputy Chief Information Officer. So our role there in the White House is we oversee all information technology and cybersecurity policy, implementation, and investments across the federal government. We spend about $86 billion on IT overall, and about $20 billion on cybersecurity specifically. So our role was to put out policy and to manage and to make sure we budgeted and prioritized our investments appropriately. So that was my role when the breach first occurred. After the breach happened, a couple of the senior leaders resigned from the agency that was breached, and I was asked to go serve in the acting CIO role there to help fix the problems that occurred during the breach. So that's just a little bit of my background. In summary, I think I want to really highlight 3 points and have you walk away with 3 really important points, all of which we talked about, but let me just summarize. One, in the 20, 30 years actually that I've been doing cybersecurity, I've never seen a stronger threat and a more focused threat coming after our information technology systems. They're constantly morphing. The threat's constantly morphing, so it's becoming increasingly hard to put up the right defenses to counter or remediate or mitigate those risks. What I do think, though, is a positive thing because of these very infamous breaches that we're hearing about over the past decade. I think we're starting to realize at the very top levels of our organization, from board of directors, from CEOs, from senior execs, that cybersecurity isn't just this thing we say, to our IT people in the back rooms, just go fix that thing, right? It's not that anymore. It is a true business risk, like every other business risk. Are we going to meet our profit numbers, and make money this year? Are we going to be able to pay our employees? Do we have good systems to do that? And what are the risks to that? And now we're starting to think about cybersecurity in that same way, and we have to continue to do that. It's not a technology problem. It really isn't. I mean, at the foundation it is, but it's a business risk, and it has to be handled as such. And what does all that mean? Because of number one, because of number two, we have to do something differently, right? What's the definition of insanity? You keep doing the same thing again and again and expect different results, okay? And we can't do that in cybersecurity anymore. We have to change the model, the way we're thinking about it, particularly with the tougher threat out there, with even more at-risk technology, such as what we're seeing with the Internet, of Things. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So let me jump right into what happened here and go into my case study. So first of all, this was not, what happened is that a specific United States agency, our Office of Personnel Management, was targeted. And not just targeted for a one-time attack, targeted over a period of about 3 to 4 years. This was an advanced persistent threat. It was a nation state who was targeting very specific information for what we believe ultimately was intelligence purposes. They weren't going after this information to collect it and sell it so that there was identity theft. There was an actual major campaign to get to this information. So what did this agency actually do? They held the records of all federal government employees, both our military as well as our civilian employees, everything from where you worked, who your family members were, what your bank accounts were, what your social security number, which is kind of our main way of tracking everybody, our main identification number. So this organization, Office of Personnel Management, that was attacked, held all that information, held security clearance information, not just for federal government employees, but for anybody, a contractor, a business entity, or individual, anybody that held a security clearance in the United States government or supporting, to include some of our foreign partners, all that information was held by this agency. So they were specifically targeted for that information. And for each personnel record or security clearance record, we collected somewhere in the neighborhood of 165 data elements. So your kid's name, your kid's social security number, every single bank account, every single financial investment that you make was all in the data holdings of this agency. What else about this particular breach? As I mentioned before, persistent motivated attackers. And I'll go through that just a little bit, but this wasn't a one-time attack. It was over a period of 3-4 years. There was advanced tactics used. Notice that I didn't say advanced technology used, okay, because as we were talking about earlier, guess how these guys got in the first place? We didn't patch systems. 30% of the systems in our infrastructure weren't even supported by the vendor anymore. That's how old some of those systems were that were on our network. Switches, routers, et cetera. Some of our host platform software was old Microsoft software. No patches, not even, so it was the basics. There was nothing very complicated about how these guys got into our network. I think it was a SQL injection, into one of our servers that just simply wasn't patched and or wasn't supported by a vendor because it was so obsolete. I think another really important point here that we touched on, this was not an opportunistic attack. It was absolutely focused. It was absolutely targeted toward this very critical agency in the federal government. So what happened ultimately and what was targeted? So what was targeted and what was breached, what was exfiltrated out of this attack? 21 million sensitive records. This is your social security records that I was talking about earlier, personnel records for all current and all past employees of the federal government back to 1987 when we automated those records, all taken. Fingerprint records, 4.5 million fingerprint records of people holding the most sensitive positions in our government were also taken. So how did this happen? What was the environment like? What was the current state of the organization? And what can we learn from this? Since you're not in this organization, what was the state? Cybersecurity was not made a priority. It wasn't funded. The executives weren't aware of what was going on with cybersecurity. It was definitely a function up through 2012, 2013 that was, the CIO will take care of that. The CIO will take care of it. But we're not going to give the CIO any funding or investments to take care of it. So that was one thing. The CIO was burdened by significant legacy systems environment. Many, like I said, about 30%, we figured that out once I got there, were not supported by the vendor. Obsolete technology. Certainly we weren't patching. In many cases we couldn't patch because there weren't even patches being put out anymore by the vendors of some of that infrastructure. Basic required security controls, no multi-factor authentication, for example, was implemented. The network was fragmented, but it was not segmented. So when I say fragmented, different parts of the same network were run by different organizations. It was not centralized under one chief information officer or under the control of one entity. Procurement, one of the things in the United States government, I'm not sure how it is here, but procurement of services and of purchasing of hardware and software is like a freaking mess in the U.S. federal government. It is a mess. It takes, I don't know, 6 months, a year to buy a new security tool, put it in place, if you can do it in that period of time. So big problem across the federal government. We were also using a lot of reactive, not proactive, monitoring and detection type tools, if we had any tools at all in that particular environment. So you can see the stage being set here for why this breach occurred and why there was such a significant impact from this breach. So how did we actually ultimately detect the breach? We actually had a pretty good chief information security officer who looked at what the current technology was across the industry. He brought in a company called Cylance. Full disclosure, I'm not trying to market Cylance. I am on their board of advisors, but it just so happened that this was the tool that we brought in. Cylance put their tool on our network. Immediately detected malicious software on the endpoint, and that had not been detected. That was one of the things we actually, at this agency, were running antivirus, like basic antivirus tools, signature-based tools that had not detected this particular exploit that was going on within our network. When Cylance immediately started dinging when we put it on there, they found the problem, or at least found that there was a problem. It took months and months to actually get into the network because it was just such a mess. It wasn't documented. We didn't know where the data was. The architecture wasn't fully laid out or illustrated. So it took quite a while for us to figure out exactly what happened, where it happened, how it happened, and what was impacted. So what we actually ended up doing, this is where where I got involved out of the, at the White House level. So is OPM reported it to us. We pulled together a team of not just technicians, but we definitely, obviously, the core of the team was really the best of the best cybersecurity experts across the federal government, across industry. On our team. But we also had to have public relations people, we had to have our budget team, we had to have our procurement representatives, we had people that were liaisons to the people who were in that database, because not all of them were employees anymore. Some of them were now private citizens, retired, et cetera. So we had to have a communications element to that team. So just kind of a lesson learned, if I don't underscore it again later in this talk, is that don't just think of this as pulling together a technical team. You actually have to have a whole team if you have a breach like this, or any type of breach, that can address all the different audiences and stakeholders that might be interested in this breach. So we pulled together that team, found the breach, determined kind of that it went on for a period of time. And what we actually discovered was that there was a series of breaches that occurred over time. So from the 2013 timeframe all the way through June of 2015, there were several different attacks and several different targets. So a lot of our network, infrastructure was actually built on COBOL-based mainframes, where we just put new technology on top of that COBOL. So the hackers actually didn't even know how to get into some of these COBOL-based systems. So the very first breach that occurred was they targeted some of the manuals and the operating protocols for those COBOL systems, so they could learn about our infrastructure, learn how to break into COBOL systems. So that documentation really, that should have probably told us in the very beginning what they were going to ultimately do. But we did happen to find that particular breach, found that those documents were taken, but nothing happened from that. Oh, well, we were breached, some documents were taken. All right, so put in a couple more controls. So that was breach number one. The second breach was these persistent attackers went into one of our vendors. So a partner, not even anybody who was actually running our network. There was a partner who had access to our network. They broke into their system, got credentials, from those individuals, used those credentials to legitimately become a user on our system. So we found that second breach, and we totally wiped out all of our systems, rebuilt, well, we thought we wiped out all of our systems, rebuilt our systems, put them back online. And then we found out through the use of this tool I just talked about, we put it online. It lit up like a friggin' Christmas tree. It was a mess. And we identified that third big breach, where actually all that data was exfiltrated. So the hackers had installed a backdoor, and they actually were smart enough and sophisticated enough to find a way to stay in our network, even when we wiped that network clean after the second breach. So this occurred over an extended period of time as well, multiple iterations of the attack. So what did we learn? What are the three main things that we learned from this attack across the federal government? We all know that the threat landscape's changing, right? And it changes really fast if you think about it. In 2000, around that time frame, we were just dealing with worms, script kiddies. They were annoying, but they weren't getting in there and stealing 21 million records, all right? Then we went into spyware, rootkits, and then during the time of the breach, the big issue was the advanced persistent threats, obviously, kind of taking advantage or exploiting very simple, basic issues within our network, openings within our network. And tomorrow, today, which is now today, really, what are we going to see next? We're moving all of our systems into the cloud. Excuse me, not all our systems, all our data into the cloud. We're a cloud-first country, so we are taking advantage of that. But what does that mean? What's the security implications of that? And what are the hackers going to start to do to attack that new surface area? Obviously, mobile is where we're at. Internet of Things. So as we put out these new technologies, we're extending our enterprise, and certainly the threat is going to take advantage of that. Are we ahead of that? Are we even close to being able to prevent the threats that are coming with that? That's something we recognized that we had to start looking at, and we had to start putting in place the plans and the architectures to mitigate these new threats against these new technologies, these new enterprises that we're putting into place. The second thing that we learned is, and this is a really important point, is that cybersecurity did not have executive attention at all. In 4 different ways. One, in terms of our mission, there was just no awareness that, my God, we have this treasure trove of information that if a nation state, particularly a non-ally specifically, gets this information, devastating to our entire intelligence community, to all of our operational aspects of what we do in our government. There was just no awareness of how important that data was, that mission was to the operations of the United States government and to our nation overall. There wasn't the correct investment. There was a good chief information security officer who pounded his head against the wall every budget cycle, trying to get money to consolidate, to centralize our networks, to put in place a real true security architecture. But his words went unheeded because the executives just didn't understand, didn't make this a priority. We had a technical architecture, like I said, absolutely fragmented, weren't even doing the basics like patch management. We didn't even know what our network was. I mean, we didn't even know half the systems, where the data was, what the endpoints were. So there wasn't even documentation of what we were dealing with. So when the breach happened, that's why it took many, many, many months to figure out exactly how far into our network and our infrastructure these hackers were. Let's see what else. So that hunting was quite complex during that process. And we were using, traditional signature-based, where we were using something on the endpoints. It was a signature-based, traditional AV-type solution. What else? Really important, underinvestment, not just technical, but we really found across the entire federal government that there was a real lack of highly qualified, highly skilled cybersecurity personnel. And I'll talk a little bit about what we did about that in the government, but that was a big problem. Process, again, we really had no plan for what our infrastructure should be, what our investments should be, how we wanted to move new technology into our infrastructure or invest in our infrastructure. We weren't running a continuous monitoring type program yet within the agency, so it was very much hit or miss. I mean, we'd look at the logs once a week or twice a month if there were any logs to look at. So it was not continuous, it was ad hoc. And the other thing is we focused, if anything, on response. Okay, if something happened, we'll pull together a team, we'll figure out what happened, and then we'll remediate. We weren't thinking about preventing that incident from happening or a breach from happening in the first place. So the third thing that really came out of this, this really tragedy, I'd have to call it, was that we did realize we needed, across the federal government, a new modern way, a new modern model to deal with the cybersecurity threat. And really 4 components. One, we had to make executives accountable. When people ask me who's responsible, in an agency for cybersecurity, a lot of folks, traditionally, or I would have said the CISO or the Chief Information Officer. Not anymore. I hold the head of the agency. We now hold the head of an agency accountable for cybersecurity in that organization. So that's the first thing we did. The second thing is we started to put in place policies and processes to reduce architecture complexity. Again, when you're just putting new tools out there, you don't have a configuration management process. You're running hybrid environments now where you have some on-prem, some cloud-based type solutions. You have to reduce that complexity. We realized we had to enhance our skills and knowledge in the area of cybersecurity across both the private sector as well as the public sector in the federal government. So we very strategically put in place some programs where we funded universities to adopt a common core criteria for training cybersecurity professionals from elementary school all the way up through graduate school, so that we could actually build a pipeline of cybersecurity professionals as opposed to just trying to retrain folks that were already there. We had to do some of that as well, so that was part of our program, but we thought a lot more strategically. Let's start this from elementary school all the way through grad school. So we came up with programs, funded universities and our public schools across the nation, so we are building that workforce now. The other thing is we're starting to shift towards the use of more artificial intelligence-based tools that use machine learning, not non-signature-based tools for the endpoint, so that we're detecting and preventing and addressing the issue. We talk about the threat. The fact of the matter is 99% of malware hashtags are only good for like 58 seconds or something. I mean, the threat's evolving that quickly. You can't keep up with that threat through signature-based endpoint solutions. You have to start using some of these machine learning, non-signature-based type tools. Now, I know there's a lot of skepticism. We were talking about it earlier, that do these tools really exist? We are finding some success with some tools that are using machine learning, as their basis as opposed to signature-based, but that's one we found we needed to move to. One of the things we did across the government, and you could certainly do this in an agency, somebody mentioned they were with a small organization, certainly you can do that. But when I talk about making executives accountable, what I mean by that is you do build it into, your board of directors have to enforce it if you're a private company or, overseen. But you also have to have measures and metrics that you put out that holds an agency overall accountable for implementing the basic cybersecurity type controls. So this is just one example. We had about 10 controls that we put in place, 10 measures across the federal government, everything from how people were training, how they were hiring, to processes in place, to one of the most important ones that we focused on. As I mentioned, we found that between 50 to 60% of our breaches across the government could have been prevented or certainly mitigated had we just started using and been using multi-factor authentication. So that's the thing that we ran a sprint on, and we pretty much got close to about 100% implementation, at least network access-wise, for multi-factor authentication. So that's how we held agencies accountable. This was briefed to our President of the United States, these statistics by agency. So if an agency wasn't doing what they needed to do, that department head actually got a call from the President to make sure that they were doing what they needed to do to fix these problems so that this type of breach didn't occur again. So I think I'm just about at the end of my time, so I will recap the bottom line about this breach and about what we learned and about what we're doing differently. One, again, the threat's evolving, right? They're constantly morphing. We can't keep doing the same things because the threat's not doing the same things. So we have to do things differently. We have to reduce our infrastructure, the complexity of our infrastructure. We have to continuously monitor. We have to bring in better skilled workforce, or more appropriately skilled workforce to deal with cybersecurity issues. We have to get our executives involved. We have to make everybody in an organization understand that this isn't purely a technical problem. This is a business problem. This is an absolute business problem. Again, I mentioned it earlier, but the fact of the matter is 2 top executives in that agency that was breached were resigned under pressure. Okay, they would have been fired, but they resigned for sure. This cost us somewhere between $200 and $400 million, and that's not even taken into account. That's pure raw numbers. That's not even counting the staff time, of people that were involved with this breach over a period of a couple years in responding to it. That was simply, we ended up paying for credit monitoring for everybody that was in our databases. That's how much it cost, just for that. So think about the cost. It's $500 million or more, really, just to recover from that one breach. So that's not a technology problem. That's a business problem. A new model's required. We have to think about this totally differently, right? So we have to have different skills in our organizations. We have to have different architectures. We have to use different tools. And we have to make this a corporate approach, not just the CIO or the CISO sitting in a back room, fighting to get a couple dollars to do this. We have to make it part of our overall corporate plan, strategic plan, business plan, fund it appropriately, monitor it appropriately, and hold everybody in the organization accountable for making sure that the right controls are in place. So I think that's my time. So thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to answer any questions about this, and I hope to God none of you are in this position and have to give this briefing in the future. So thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you.